For more than 3 decades, a predator haunted California. He moved in silence, striking in the dead of night. He tied families up in their own homes, whispered threats through clenched teeth, and disappeared before the police could arrive. He left behind broken lives, terrified neighborhoods, and grieving families. For years, investigators chased shadows. The evidence was always just out of reach. Leads went cold, suspects slipped away, and the victims, they were left waiting. When the man behind the mask was finally revealed, the world expected closure. But what followed wasn't justice, it was something far less. This is the story of how it took more than 30 years to catch one of America's most notorious criminals, and how, even then, he faced very little justice for what he did. The late 1970s were a time of transition in California. Suburban neighborhoods were spreading, families were settling into new developments, and life seemed safe, almost idyllic. But in the quiet of those cul-de-sacs, something sinister was lurking. The first reports sounded like simple burglaries, a prowler creeping through neighborhoods, stolen wallets, missing jewelry, doors found ajar in the morning. But soon, the crimes escalated. In 1976, in the Sacramento area, a masked man began breaking into homes. He was careful, deliberate. He stalked his victims in advance, learning their routines, cutting phone lines, even arranging escape routes before he ever struck. When he finally made his move, he was merciless. Victims were startled awake at gunpoint, tied with shoelaces, and silenced with threats. Women were assaulted while their husbands or boyfriends lay helpless, bound and blindfolded. The attacks carried a signature of psychological terror. The intruder would sometimes spend hours inside the home, rummaging through personal belongings, eating food from the kitchen, or whispering cruel words to his victims. No one felt safe. By 1978, the assaults had spread across Sacramento and into neighboring counties. The press dubbed him the East Area Rapist. Neighborhoods formed watch groups. Gun sales spiked. Families started locking their doors with multiple deadbolts, and people slept with lights on. But no one could stop him. As the months turned to years, the intruder's violence escalated. He grew bolder, more vicious, more unpredictable. Couples were his preferred targets. He would tie the man up, stack plates on his back, and whisper, "If I hear these plates move, she dies." Then, he would turn his attention to the woman, dragging out the ordeal for hours while the man lay paralyzed with fear. He always wore a mask, he always carried a weapon, and he always left before police could catch him. By the end of the 1970s, his crimes numbered in the dozens. His reign of terror was spreading, and he was only just getting started. In 1979, the nightmare reached a chilling new level. A couple in Goleta, California, was found brutally murdered in their home. Soon after, more killings followed, always in the same pattern. A break-in, a couple tied up, a violent, horrifying end. The man who once prowled Sacramento as a rapist was now a killer. But police across California weren't yet connecting the dots. Different counties had different cases, and communication between agencies was limited. What one department saw as an isolated murder, another saw as a home invasion. Few realized they were dealing with the same man. It would take years and advances in forensic science for investigators to piece together the horrifying truth. The East Area Rapist had evolved into the killer now terrorizing Southern California. By the mid-1980s, the attacks stopped as suddenly as they had begun. No one knew why. Did he move away? Did he die? Or had he simply decided to stop? For victims, the silence wasn't comforting. It was haunting. They lived with constant fear, wondering if he would return, if the masked man would ever come back to finish what he started. By then, he had a new name, the original Night Stalker. Years later, the cases would all be tied together under one title, the Golden State Killer. For law enforcement, he was a ghost. For victims, he was a shadow that never left their minds. And for more than 30 years, he remained free. For years, the attacker seemed unstoppable. Police sketches based on survivors' descriptions showed an average-looking white male, around 5 feet 10 inches, lean build, sometimes with light hair. But the mask he always wore left victims with only fragments of memory. He moved like a phantom. He never stayed in one place for long, never left behind fingerprints, and seemed to know exactly how to avoid capture. Some investigators believed he was law enforcement, or at least had police training because of his methods. Every crime scene showed preparation. He used shoelaces to tie victims, but the knots were complex and deliberate. He often slipped through neighborhoods without being seen, as if he'd memorized the layout. And he always seemed to know when police were closing in. By the mid-1980s, there were more than 50 rapes and at least 10 murders attributed to him. Families demanded answers. Police, desperate for leads, released recordings of the suspect's taunting phone calls, where he whispered threats to his past victims. The voice was chilling, but it led nowhere. The predator remained faceless. By the 1990s, technology was catching up. DNA analysis was beginning to revolutionize law enforcement. Samples collected from crime scenes years earlier were tested, and for the first time, investigators confirmed what many had long suspected. The East Area Rapist, the original Night Stalker, and the unknown murderer terrorizing Southern California were the same man. The crimes were connected, but knowing that didn't solve the case. His DNA profile was unique, and it didn't match anyone in the criminal databases. He was still out there, living a normal life, hiding in plain sight. Leads came and went. Suspects were interviewed, cleared, and forgotten. Retired detectives handed the case files to new recruits. The families of victims grew old waiting for justice. Some began to wonder if the man was even alive anymore. Others feared he was still out there, watching, waiting, and laughing at how easily he'd escaped. By 2018, the case had been cold for decades. But investigators weren't ready to give up. A new idea was taking hold in the world of forensic science, using genealogy websites to track criminals. When people submitted their DNA to find relatives, they unknowingly created databases that could also be used for law enforcement. Investigators uploaded the Golden State Killer's DNA profile into one of these databases and waited. The results were astonishing. The system identified distant relatives, third and fourth cousins of the suspect. From there, genealogists began building family trees, connecting names, dates, and places until they narrowed the possibilities down to a single man. His name was Joseph James DeAngelo. Joseph DeAngelo was 72 years old. He lived in a quiet Sacramento suburb. He had worked as a police officer in the 1970s, but later became a mechanic. He had been married, raised children, and lived the life of an ordinary suburban grandfather. But beneath the facade was a monster. Investigators surveilled him carefully. They collected DNA from items he discarded, a tissue, a piece of trash. When the lab results came back, they confirmed what families had been waiting more than 40 years to hear. DeAngelo was the Golden State Killer. On April 24, 2018, police surrounded DeAngelo's home. After decades of dead ends and frustration, they finally had their man. Neighbors watched in shock as the frail-looking old man was led away in handcuffs. To them, he was just Joe, a quiet retiree who rode his motorcycle and kept to himself. But to the families of more than 60 victims, he was the nightmare that had haunted their lives for decades. The faceless predator finally had a name. The arrest of Joseph James DeAngelo stunned the nation. For decades, people had imagined the Golden State Killer as a shadowy figure, always lurking in the dark. Instead, he was an elderly man who had lived quietly in the suburbs. The question everyone asked was simple: how did he get away with it for so long? The answer was a disturbing combination of skill, circumstance, and luck. DeAngelo's time as a police officer in the 1970s gave him a critical advantage. He understood investigative procedures, knew how patrols worked, and was trained to think like law enforcement. Former colleagues recalled that he was strict, by the book, and sometimes explosive. He was eventually fired for shoplifting, but during his years on the force, he had already begun committing his crimes. That training meant he knew how to leave almost nothing behind. He wore gloves, removed shoelaces from homes ahead of time, and slipped through neighborhoods with the confidence of someone who had patrolled them himself. Outwardly, DeAngelo appeared ordinary. He worked steady jobs, married, raised 3 daughters, and lived in modest homes. He mowed his lawn, chatted with neighbors, and shopped for groceries like anyone else. To the world, he was just another middle-class man. But behind closed doors, his family saw flashes of rage. He was known to have a violent temper, prone to explosive outbursts. Some neighbors remembered him screaming in his yard late at night. Still, no one suspected he was the predator who had terrorized California for years. Another reason he escaped capture was timing. During the 1970s and 1980s, DNA technology was not yet advanced. Police relied on fingerprints, eyewitness descriptions, and shoe prints, evidence DeAngelo knew how to avoid. Different police departments didn't share information as easily as they do today. Crimes in Sacramento weren't immediately connected to murders in Santa Barbara or Orange County. By the time investigators realized the same man was responsible, he had already vanished. By the mid-1980s, the attacks suddenly stopped. For more than 30 years, there were no new reports connected to the Golden State Killer. Some believed he had died. Others thought he had been imprisoned for unrelated crimes. But the truth was even more unsettling. He simply went back to living an ordinary life. He raised his children, worked as a truck mechanic, and blended into suburban life. For decades, he carried his dark secret without being discovered. The families of his victims lived with nightmares, while DeAngelo attended barbecues, birthdays, and weddings, pretending to be just another neighbor. The only thing that connected him to the past was his DNA, tiny, invisible traces left at crime scenes, preserved for decades in evidence lockers. When technology finally caught up, those traces told the truth. DeAngelo's mask of normalcy was ripped away. The mystery of how he evaded justice for so long revealed a chilling truth. Sometimes, monsters don't hide in the shadows. Sometimes they hide in plain sight. When Joseph James DeAngelo was unmasked as the Golden State Killer, the world expected a trial that would finally bring full justice. For the victims' families, this was the moment they had waited for. The chance to see him answer for the horrors he had inflicted. But reality was more complicated. Many of DeAngelo's crimes dated back to the 1970s and 1980s. By law, the statute of limitations had expired on most of the rapes and assaults. What prosecutors could charge him with were 13 murders and 13 related kidnappings. The rest, dozens of rapes, hundreds of burglaries, would remain unpunished in court. In 2020, the world watched as DeAngelo appeared in court. Once feared as a violent predator, he now looked frail, slumped in a wheelchair, whispering in a weak voice. Some wondered if it was an act designed to gain sympathy. One by one, prosecutors detailed the crimes he was admitting to: 13 murders, 13 kidnappings, and alongside them he acknowledged, though could not be legally punished for, more than 50 rapes. Victims and their families were given a chance to speak. For some, it was the first time they had voiced their pain in decades. They spoke of broken families, sleepless nights, marriages destroyed, children growing up in fear, and the lifelong scars of what he had done. One woman, assaulted in her teens, told DeAngelo, "You took away my innocence, my trust, and my peace, but you will never take away my strength." Another survivor said simply, "You were a monster. Now you're nothing." Through it all, DeAngelo sat silent, his eyes cast down. He offered no emotion, no apology, until the very end. At the conclusion of his sentencing, DeAngelo stood with help from guards. In a barely audible whisper, he said, "I listened to all your statements. I am truly sorry to everyone I hurt." For many victims, it was too little, too late. The words felt hollow after decades of silence. In August 2020, Joseph DeAngelo was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. At 74 years old, it was effectively a death sentence by time. But for many, the punishment felt incomplete. He had stolen decades of peace, destroyed families, and haunted entire communities. Yet he would never face the death penalty, never face the full measure of justice for the majority of his crimes. For survivors, the conviction was bittersweet. Yes, the mask had been ripped away. Yes, the monster was behind bars. But the damage could never be undone. Today, DeAngelo lives out his days in a California prison. He is an old man now, frail and isolated, far removed from the terror he once inflicted. But the scars of his actions remain. Every survivor, every family, every community he touched carries a shadow of what he did. For many, true justice never came. What they received was accountability, a name, a face, and a sentence. But the wounds of the past remain unhealed. The Golden State Killer case left behind more than trauma. It changed the way America thinks about cold cases and forensic science. It proved the power of DNA, not only in identifying criminals but in connecting crimes across decades. It introduced genetic genealogy as a revolutionary tool, now used to solve dozens of previously unsolvable cases. It highlighted the failures of a justice system where statutes of limitations left countless victims without their day in court. But above all, it reminded us that evil can wear an ordinary face. The man who mowed his lawn, shopped for groceries, and raised a family was the same man who had terrorized California in the dead of night. It took more than 3 decades to unmask Joseph James DeAngelo. For years, he blended into the background of ordinary life, a predator hiding in plain sight. When the truth finally came out, it shook the nation. The faceless figure from the 1970s was revealed as an old man. Someone's father, someone's neighbor, someone no one suspected. He is now in prison, but his victims know justice will never be complete. The lives he destroyed, the fear he spread, and the innocence he stole cannot be measured in court sentences. In the end, he faced very little justice for what he did. But his story will never be forgotten. The Golden State Killer lived in the shadows for decades. And even though his freedom is gone, the shadow of his crimes still lingers over California and over the families who waited a lifetime for answers.